So to begin with, we need to understand what a constitution is and what constitutionalism is. In short, a constitution is a founding document that creates an institution or an organization or a country. It also has foundational principles as well as foundational laws, to which all other laws must be consistent. Looking at the history of constitutionalism, we draw our minds back to the year 1215, where an unpopular king in England, King John, was trying to broker peace between himself and some rebel barons who were defying the king, this being a revolutionary act in itself. The rebel barons and the king came together, mediated by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop of Canterbury then drew up what was called the Magna Carta Libertarium, or the Great Charter of Freedoms, the first time that freedoms or limitations of public power, wherein the royal subjects at the time were able to act without fear of retribution or punishment against a king, and the king had to adhere to certain limitations. The first incantation of this was not successful, and the document was quickly revoked. When King John died and his son Henry III took the crown, he reintroduced a more toned-down version of the Magna Carta, now just called the Magna Carta as opposed to the Magna Carta Libertarium, and eventually this led to more formalized laws and the Parliament in England. So this is a long history of documents creating the limitation of power. We can see these documents popping up through Europe through the written and recorded histories, but it really takes more effect when we get to the 17th century and we look at the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a revolt against the stark inequalities between the highly rich nobility and the famished and dying poor of France. This led to a violent revolution and ultimately removing nobility from France. What took its place was our first example of a well-founded, complete constitution. This constitution looked only at first-generation rights, and we'll get into what different generations of rights are later in the lecture. But it was a document to which all other laws in the country had to be compliant, and which created firm and very clear limitations of public power, which no powers of state could derogate. So first generation rights in this regard were freedom of association, democracy, the right to vote, freedom of expression, and many of the other first generation rights that we look at. The bottom line behind this is that now we had a state, a republic, not a monarchy, that looked at limiting state power. And so we have, instead of being subjects of a king or being subjects of a state, the state now became servants of the people. And we see this great change in the way we see statehood. And many, many other countries in Europe followed suit. But not to the extent that the American Revolution led to the American Constitution, which was a more robust and more considered document, only because it had time to reflect on previous constitutions. The American Revolution led to the Constitution of the United States of America. This had more entrenched limitations of public rights, more civil liberties, and more mechanisms by which all of this had to happen. So there was more of a mechanized understanding that there needed to be implementation for rights to take effect. We see the rights, the Bill of Rights, in the American Constitution being something very much for its own time, but there were some unalienable rights. All men are created equal, although the definition of man at the time that the Constitution was drafted would be questionable. Also freedom of expression, and also the limitation of public power. So we see that there is a great deal of development in constitutionalism as we go forward. I would like to just point out at this stage that constitutionalism and rights are distinct from each other. Rights have a much older and much richer history than constitutionalism, and we'll go into that in a following segment of this lecture. Thank you.